Hello everyone, Litrostorm here, and today we are back talking about something we don't normally talk about. Today we'll be talking about JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Now I haven't actually made any videos on JoJo, and that is for one simple reason. Up until about a month ago, I have not seen any of the series, but luckily I had the chance to watch all of Part 1 and 4 episodes of Part 2. And so today I'm going to be reviewing Part 1, Phantom Blood. Now I've heard mixed reviews within the community, however most of them agree that the series gets better as it goes on, and that Part 1 honestly isn't that good. However, I have seen a couple people who actually defend Part 1 and say that it's one of the best. Now that I've watched it, I've decided I'll give you guys my thoughts on it. So without further ado, make sure you join my Discord and follow me on Twitter, and also subscribe and like the video if you do end up enjoying it, as it always helps out the channel. But anyway, without further ado, let's get into the video. So in contemplating how to make this video, I could not decide how I wanted to structure it. But eventually though, I decided that I wanted to go character by character, and discuss the good and bad of each and every one, with throwing in some minor details that aren't character related here and there. So, let's just get into it with the first character, Erina Pendleton. Now, I think that Erina is actually handled well in episode 1. She is supposed to be the love interest for our main protagonist, Jonathan Joestar. And I think, once again, that she's handled pretty well. She basically likes Jonathan, and Jonathan likes her. However, Dio, in wanting to take everything away from Jonathan, actually ends up stealing her first kiss. And so because of that, she feels great shame and guilt and all that, and she basically doesn't want to see Jonathan anymore because she doesn't want to show her face around him. And so I think she's actually used pretty well to cause a rift between them, and eventually lead to Jonathan actually fighting back against Dio. Of course, he had tried to fight back before, but it really didn't do much. However, after that, he finally actually does something. Unfortunately though, after that character, she stops developing and existing, because she doesn't come back until episode 4. And in episode 4, she reunites with Jonathan because there's been a huge time skip and now Jonathan is injured, so she's actually healing him and tending to his wounds. But then Jonathan has to go on this quest to defeat Dio, and he even mentions that he forgot to say goodbye to her. And that is never brought up again. Ever. And while that might sound like a minor nitpick, I think consequence should be something key to about every story, especially if our character is going to be forgetful or is going to make big decisions and choices and mistakes. That needs to weigh on their shoulders, at least in some regard. Maybe not something big, but maybe like he comes back and she's like, oh, you forgot to say goodbye to me, but it's okay. You know, at least mention it again. And this ultimately feels like such a big sting because at the end, they reunite, and the first time you see them together after all that, they are just married, and she's pregnant, and they're happy. Like, that's such a big jarring change. But anyway, another thing I want to point out about her is that she's really only used as a plot device so that way Part 2 can exist. I mean, she doesn't really develop that much. She gets a build-up to her character at the beginning, which I already said was good. But past that point, all she really does is save a child and conceive a child with Jonathan, and those two children end up having Jonathan's grandson, who is Joseph Joestar and is the main protagonist of Part 2. Ultimately, she's gone for a good portion of the series. Most of the episodes she doesn't even appear in, so she really just seems like a plot device so that way there can be a sequel. But anyway, moving past that, let's move on to our next character, Speedwagon. Now, Speedwagon is a big fan favorite among the JoJo community. I am not even in that community, and I still know that everybody likes him. Now, seeing him, I actually did like him in his first appearance. He had really great development in recognizing that Jonathan was a good person and wanting to turn a new leaf. I thought that after Jonathan went on Ogre Street and body slammed all the thugs without, like, killing them, because he recognized that they were still people who had families and he didn't want to take them away, I thought that was great. And maybe that's just me loving those types of moralistic characters. I do. I love characters with no killing rules or with just morals that are above them. And so seeing that actually happen and have an impact to where Speedwagon actually recognizes that and manages to convince all the other thugs because like a huge mob shows up. And he manages to tell them, no, this guy is a true gentleman. He spared us all. And so I love that he actually develops in that way despite only showing up in that episode. That was his first episode and he had already changed so much as a character. However, then he starts to change way too much. Because after that point, he basically just becomes Jonathan's Chaozu if you consider Jonathan Ten Shinhan. He's basically there, does nothing, and is just a lackey. Like, oh yeah, you can get him, yeah, we love you, you're cool. That's all he does. He gets way too over-emotional about fights he has absolutely no stake in. When the battle in episode 3 comes about, and Jonathan is fighting Dio, he has no stake in that. He could run away at any point, and he had just met Jonathan in the first place. It's not like he has like some ultimate vengeance against Dio, right? And so when he's sitting there crying, saying, "Yo, Jonathan, you can do it, I hope you live, ah," and he's crying over a fight that has no value to him. He could run away, and as far as he knows, that fight would never come to bite him ever. But he doesn't. He's just Jonathan's lackey for the entire series. It ultimately makes me really sad because his development was handled very well in his first appearance. And as he kept on going throughout the series, he just seemed to be worse. I think it could have been much better if he would have been hardened at first. Maybe he thinks to himself, why should I go with this guy? And Jonathan reminds him that he had spared his life and that he wouldn't abandon him, and that's when he does that. Because he is a hardened crime boss. Remember that the whole mob listened to this guy, which means that he must be a higher ranking crime boss. And so for him to just sit there and cry over a fight between two guys he just met, it just sounds really bad. I have no idea how he is a fan favorite at all. But anyway, speaking of fan favorites that I don't like, let's move on to Zeppeli. Now Zeppeli is basically a Deus Ex Machina. He shows up at just the perfect time. Jonathan and Dio have just gotten through their battle, and Jonathan thinks that he had killed Dio. Jonathan is also injured, so Zeppeli shows up at just the perfect time when he's injured and thinks Dio is dead, and heals his injury, and then informs him that, nah, Dio's alive. So it's very just contrived, honestly. He shows up, solves all of Jonathan's problems. Now he's healed, which means he's in perfect fighting condition, and he knows that Dio's alive, which means that he has to train in Hamon. He then does so. Luckily, Zeppeli is a master of Hamon, and so he teaches Jonathan how to use it. And in a week, Jonathan becomes very good at Hamon. And not only is it just 1 week, that 1 week is shown to us through 2 very short scenes. And so when you have a character train and get massively stronger, you want to give foreshadowing. You want to show just how much stronger they've become. Or at the very least, you want to give us multiple scenes, or at least long scenes, where we see their training in extensive length. Maybe not even extensive length, maybe just multiple scenes. Like every now and then, you see a little bit of their training, just so that way it feels more impactful. However, here, stating that it's only 1 week of training, and then giving us only 2 short scenes where he's doing training, just ultimately makes Jonathan feel like he should be a lot weaker than he is, and I'll get into just how strong he is later, so you can actually see what I mean. Now, by this point, Zeppeli has shown up, solved all of Jonathan's problems, as I said before, and then we come to find that Dio had actually turned Jack the Ripper into a zombie vampire. And so now they have to fight Jack the Ripper. And so Jack the Ripper actually tries to fight Zeppeli, but he completely dodges and body slams him easily. He literally pours a wine glass, hands it to Jonathan, and says, "You do it, and if you spill a single drop, I will abandon you." But basically, he just shows up and he's this god, right? He solves all of Jonathan's problems, and he body slams Dio's allies. However, that all then changes in the very next episode, where both Zeppeli and Jonathan combined are 5 times weaker than Dio. Dio is 5 times stronger than both of them combined. Dio also injures Zeppeli easily. So it ultimately just feels very jarring when he goes from the god, and then he's just complete fodder. It feels really weird. Speaking of him being fodder, he dies very soon after. A couple episodes after, he dies. So there's this whole backstory with Zeppeli where he asks his mentor when he will die, to see if he completes his mission of getting the mask. And so he's actually told this cryptic stuff, like I don't remember what it was, but it was like 2 guys are chained and you get in the middle or something. And that's exactly what happens. Jonathan and a zombie knight are against the wall, and then Zeppeli gets in the middle, tries to help Jonathan, and dies. And that death is very unimpactful for many reasons. The first being that he was only there for a couple of episodes. Now this actually won't ring true for every character, because I think that George Joestar's death is actually a decently bit impactful, despite him having less episodes than Zeppeli. But the difference is that we don't get many scenes with Zeppeli humanizing him. We get a decent amount of scenes of George being humanized. But Zeppeli, no, he just kind of is the mentor. And he has a backstory where he has to get the mask. And that's it. And so his death is just not impactful to me in any way. I didn't feel anything when he died. He then gives Jonathan his life energy and gives him another huge amp. And that is where Zeppeli is dead. And I can now say that he is the most bland, unoriginal mentor character I have ever seen in any series I've ever watched. Because he shows up at the perfect time, has the perfect answers to everything, then becomes fodder in an instant, and then dies. And he ultimately doesn't do anything very creative. He just teaches him Hamon, and that's it. His only fights are the one where he bodies someone that his student can easily body despite only having a week's worth of training, him being brutally injured by Dio, and then him dying. Those are his only fights. Now going past Zeppeli as the character, I want to talk about his master and his partners in training, which were actually his friends when he was training under his master. So they eventually show up and join Jonathan to fight Dio after Zeppeli died. But one of his friends gets killed, and the other one and his master don't really do anything other than hold off the zombie vampires that way Jonathan and Dio can fight. And I really just wonder why they're there. Like, they could have just not existed, and it would have been perfectly fine. And then I remember that part 2 has the friend that survives become evil and become a horrible villain. But he deserves his own separate video. Anyway, let's move on to the next character, George Joestar. So now that we're actually getting into the decent characters, we're going to be talking about Jonathan's father. I think that he has a very interesting setup. I think the whole series has a very interesting setup. Now let me explain why I think it's interesting, because part 1 actually begins with George and his wife getting into a carriage accident with their baby son, and that is of course Jonathan. And all of a sudden, a man and his wife, the man named Dario Brando, shows up and begins looting their corpses. However, he finds that George is actually alive, and George actually mistakes him as a savior. He thinks that he is trying to save them. And that is very interesting because now George thinks he owes a debt to Dario, which eventually comes into fruition when Dario gives Dio a letter to get into the Joestar mansion, and that's basically how the whole series happens. I think that he is developed and humanized enough, as I had pointed out earlier, to actually have a decently impactful death. I don't think it was a crazy impactful death, like it didn't have like so much weight that I like cried or something, but I don't really expect things to make me cry. It's decently impactful, it's good, it works. Speaking of a character that works, let's now move on to Poco. Now this is actually going to be a very, very, very small section, so I'm padding it out by saying that it's very small. Anyway, he's basically a kid who accidentally winds up joining Jonathan, Zeppeli, and Speedwagon, and he basically has a mini character arc about being useful, and eventually he is useful and actually helps Zeppeli get into the fight between Jonathan and the zombie knight, and also taking responsibility when he learns of his sister being kidnapped and he actually feels guilty for it since he should have been home by that point. I think that both of those are nice, and they do help to add a little bit of depth to a just minor character, but I think they work well enough. But no more talk about minor characters, let's now talk about the big two, Jonathan and Dio. Of course, we're going to be starting with Jonathan since he's the protagonist. Now, this may be something that I just love personally, but I love Jonathan's morality. If they have a no killing rule, I am more inclined to like them, and that's not saying I can't like characters who don't have a no killing rule. I like plenty of characters who don't. Those types of characters just really resonate with me. I really like them. But basically, I just love those types of characters, and Jonathan is one of those characters. He doesn't kill, and eventually it does come into play as I discussed earlier with Speedwagon. Anyway though, I love his development on trying to be nice to Dio, but ultimately failing, and eventually having a great rivalry and clash with him. Even when the show doesn't have like super hyped up supernatural vampire stuff, the boys just clashing, being boys, and it helps add development before the series goes complete bonkers. Now surprisingly, I wasn't really finding myself too interested in him, but toward the end of episode 1, when he actually gets revenge and starts beating Dio up, I actually was really hyped. I found myself looking back on it and being like, wow, I actually was hyped during that. That is very surprising. But anyway, I love his journey on Ogre Street, displaying his morality and its effects on Speedwagon. Of course, I already discussed this earlier though, but you basically get what I mean. Another thing I love about their journey on Ogre Street is the parallels between his and Dio's journey. In that his was to ensure the life of someone he loves. He had to go expose Dio to make sure that his father could live. While Dio's was to ensure the death of someone he hates. He went on to Ogre Street thinking that Jonathan had already died, but just going to make sure and wanting to finish the job in case he wasn't. The outcomes of their journeys are also great parallels. Where Jonathan achieved his goal through virtue, Dio lied in failure because of his hatred. I love that he still wants to believe the good in Dio, even though it very clearly does not exist. In scenes where he is actually trying to resonate with Dio and trying to get to understand him better after he is caught, Dio is literally contemplating killing him in the exact same scene, and going about tricking him into thinking that he is actually going to turn a new leaf. The impact of his father's death boosting his resolve is great. One thing about Jonathan is that he is just resolve amp after resolve amp after resolve amp. And of course that can kind of be annoying, however I think that it works pretty well with his character. Now I also love the battle with Dio in episode 3 as the rivalry expands. The way Jonathan manages to fight against Dio despite being a regular guy versus a vampire is amazing. The fact that he actually wins in the end through strategy is also very amazing. I just love that fight. It's very climactic, and I'm going to say that a lot about the fight, but it just is. However, something that isn't awesome is how fast Jonathan gets overpowered. After meeting Zeppeli, which I explained earlier, Jonathan is trained for 1 week, which is shown through 2 short scenes, and then he is automatically able to kill Jack the Ripper zombie vampire guy through a wall with 1 punch without spilling a single drop of wine. I think that is just way too overpowered, way too fast. A lot of interesting things that are played up in anime are when the mentor sets an unprecedented goal, a goal that is way too high for their student, and the student fails, but shows that they actually strived and tried to actually do it as hard as they could, and so the mentor takes it back. Like for instance with Kakashi. The whole point was teamwork, and so they failed as a team. That was the point. Stuff like that. However, here, Jonathan completely passes the test, despite this being his first time using Hamon in combat, and us not really feeling the effects of his training due to it only being 2 very, very, very short scenes, and because the actual length of his training in-universe is only 1 week. That sounds very short to go from 0 to hero. Bluford's character, the Zombie Vampire Knight #1, is actually great. I love his death, and I love that it strengthens Jonathan's resolve. That honestly is one of the best parts in part 1, since it establishes just what Dio is doing, and that even people with such pure and loyal souls, like a knight who literally died trying to protect his queen, just are completely corrupted by him. And I love that Jonathan sees that, and it actually amps him up, both physically and mentally. Now after Zeppeli dies, which I already discussed, Jonathan gets a super amp after he gets his life energy. And that is when the first final battle against Dio happens. Now this fight is very climactic, just like I said before, and really just shows how far Jonathan has come. He ultimately has become very skilled and still manages to beat Dio despite him being an immortal vampire. I love that. The second final battle is also very climactic and creative, having bodiless Dio show up into the same ship that Erina and Jonathan are going on, and then infecting the whole place before they even show up is genius. I love that. It's a very great setting for them to fight. However, that is when a problem with the final fight comes at play. Jonathan does not die. Even after getting his lung punctured and saying in his head that he can't breathe or talk, he continues to breathe and talk for the next 5 minutes. He's still alive, he's still going. I actually had to take a look on the time on the episode when he said that, and then when he actually died, which he does die, and it was like so long. it didn't make any sense. However, I do think that the parallels between Jonathan wanting Erina to save a baby whose mom died, and him being a baby when his mom died, is pretty nice, though it is kind of a loose connection. It still feels good. And ultimately, his death alongside Dio is very fitting and a great way to end his character arc, still wanting to accept Dio as his brother. Speaking of Dio, we now have to talk about him. Now, let's just get this straight out of the way. Dio's motivation sucks. He wants to get back at his father for driving his mother to death and abusing him, so he poisons him. Okay, makes sense. Now, once he realizes that he's going to die, he tells Dio to go to the Joestar mansion and become the richest man in the world. And so Dio tries to stick it to his father by doing exactly what he wants. Like, it doesn't make sense. Even if you become 1 quadrillion times more rich than the second richest person, then you're still the richest person in the world. So ultimately, you using this to stick it to your father doesn't make any sense. It'd be like if someone punched you in the face and then told you to grab the pickle jar, and then you grabbed the pickle jar and said, "Oh, I'll show you, I'll grab the pickle jar harder than you ever have." It's dumb. Anyway though, let's now move on. Unfortunately, I still don't have anything good to say about him, because his character is just kind of bland and predictable at first. Just being the kid who is praised by the father, but is secretly bad. He beats up Jonathan, he spreads rumors about him, makes everyone hate him, beats him up publicly as well, and the father is praising him. "Oh yeah, Jonathan, why can't you be like Dio?" It's very predictable, it's very bland, it's very obvious. However, luckily, his motivation grows to be much better, as it slowly becomes a more personal vendetta against Jonathan. I love the evolution of his motivation and hatred toward Jonathan. Again, all the parallels between Dio and Jonathan's journey is amazing. I already talked about that. But now let's talk about what actually happens in Dio's journey. Dio takes the mask, which was a thing. I didn't mention it before, but it's a thing. And activates it using some guy on the street's blood, and puts it on another guy, which turns him into a vampire. Now, let's now talk about the show handling the transitions into supernatural elements very well. It does so great. That is ultimately my favorite part of the show, is that it really is good at supernatural stuff. Now, Dio then gets attacked by said vampire, nearly killing him, but luckily he survives due to the sun coming up and burning him alive. He makes it back home where he's finally busted, but becomes a vampire after killing George Joestar. The battle is once again very climactic. I already said this, so yeah. After this, Dio begins to build up his army of zombie vampires by turning Jack the Ripper. This is ultimately really cool, and really does make it feel like it takes place in 1880s London. It really didn't feel that way before, besides the whole carriage thing, but other than that, it really does feel awesome that it takes an actual realistic element of our world and kind of implements it in its own way. Eventually, it's revealed that Dio has ice powers, which is very jarring and leaves many questions. Where did he get those powers? He didn't have them beforehand, so it must have been from the mask. What do ice powers have to do with being a vampire? There's no connection at all. Why didn't he use them in the fight against Jonathan? Also, why did the guy Dio turn into a vampire with a mask in episode 2 not have any power? If the powers take time to cultivate, then why does Dio never say that? In fact, why does no one ever question why he has ice powers? They just kind of realize, oh no, he has ice powers, and then continue on like it's a normal thing. There's no observation about why or how he has ice powers, despite being a vampire, which has nothing to do with ice. And it would be a minor problem if it weren't for the fact that he uses the ice powers to give Zeppeli frostbite, which takes him out of the fight for a good while, as well as using them against Jonathan in their first final fight, which ultimately leads to Jonathan using fire against the ice to defeat Dio. Anyway, moving past the ice thing, which is something that just really bugged me, Dio builds up the ranks of the zombie vampires and eventually finds a mother and her baby. We get a really awesome and creative scene where he offers to turn both of them so that way they can be happy together, but the mother chooses to spare her baby of the horror and gets bitten herself, which leads to her eating the baby. Yes, it is very morbid, but it is freaking awesome. I love the creativity. I just love it. Once again, just about everything supernatural is handled excellently and is very creative. Now, the first final fight comes along and feels like a huge clash between Dio and Jonathan, and is very grand scale, ending in Dio getting his head cut off. The 9th episode sees Jonathan and Erina going on a ship that has been infested with zombie vampires, and Dio is actually still alive as a head. Speaking of still being alive, let's get to the final fight. He's come to take Jonathan's body, and despite being a head, still puts up a great fight, as well as all of his minions who are on the ship now. However, I do have to wonder why he chose to strike now, considering the time jump between episodes 8 and 9 sees Erina and Jonathan having not been together and then being married with Erina pregnant. I kind of feel like it would have made more sense if he would have just gone after the entire town again and secretly done that, and then it would be a much bigger area and there would be way more people that would be under his reign, but sure, whatever. All in all, Dio's death alongside Jonathan feels like a very fitting end to his character, and how even though he may not be redeemable, his adopted father and brother still believed in him, even in death. And speaking of his death, he is now dead forever, and he never comes back. Ever. Just like Captain America in Avengers. Never comes back. Ever. And now that I've talked about this show for a very long time, I'm now going to give my final verdict. I think that, ultimately, this show has a lot of problems, but it does succeed in a few good areas, in a few good characters, but I don't think that it's enough to save it from a low ranking. I don't think it's horrible, I don't even think it's bad. I just think that it is decent. So yeah guys, let me know if you actually enjoyed the review. I feel like there's going to be a lot of die-hard fans in the comments talking about why they disagree and why it's actually perfection. But even people who disagree with me, I hope can actually find some validity in some of my points. And those who do agree with me, I hope can find some resonation in actually being able to find someone who agrees. But anyway guys, that's been it for my review. If you did enjoy this video, please be sure to like it, and if you want to see more what-ifs or even more reviews, let me know what you want me to review, by the way. Let me know if I should go and try to finish part 2 and actually do a review. If I get enough reason to do it from you guys, then I will definitely do so. And yeah, just like, subscribe, do all that, you know, stuff like that. And that's been it for the review. I'm gonna see you guys later. Bye.